If you were a kid or teenager, or heck, even an anime-loving adult in the 90s, then you remember the Pokémon craze. There were trading cards, shows, movies, toys, video games, and so much more merchandise, all bearing that familiar red and white Pokeball that we all grew to know and love. Pokemon is still going strong today, even though the popular hysteria phase wore off sometime in the early 2000s. It's still loved by millions of people across the globe, and its fan base continues to expand with each new generation. I wish I could say that the story I'm about to tell you is a pleasant one. One about the fandom and the community that grew beyond Pokemon. Unfortunately, that's not the case. I'm about to tell you a story about a man I knew who used to live on my block in the late 90s. A man that loved Pokemon a little too much. Everybody knew him by name, but we called him the Pokémon Man. The Pokémon Man, or Greg Hooper, was a man in his 30s who lived by himself in an apartment unit below me. He was very nice to everyone who lived in the building, and there wasn't a day that went by where he didn't make some type of small talk with just about everybody. From what I knew from word of mouth, he worked in marketing for an animation company. He had a girlfriend named Kelly, and was said to have come over most of the time. And he was absolutely obsessed with Pokemon. As a kid who also loved Pokemon, I thought it was pretty neat that there was an adult who loved something that was pretty much advertised for kids. And when I say obsessed, I mean obsessed. He wore shirts, hats, had a Pikachu bumper sticker on his Honda Civic, and always showed the kids in the apartment complex how he owned pretty much every card up to that point in time. I was amazed by this man, and so were all the other kids. The parents, however, had some shred of doubt about Greg's character. They thought he took his infatuation of Pokemon a little too far, and it made them think there might be something wrong with him upstairs, if you know what I mean. Of course, that was merely a shred of doubt. Like I said before, everyone loved the man. So you could see their misconceptions about him were just their way of trying to analyze someone they didn't quite understand. Anyway, so here was the Pokemon superfan that lived a floor beneath me. I would see him from time to time, and each time I learned something new about Pokemon. Everything from Easter eggs in the Game Boy Color's Pokemon Gold, to the inspiration behind Team Rocket's creation. There was always something to be learned from the Pokemon Man. And just like that, everything about Greg Hooper, the greatest Pokemon expert in town, changed in an instant, on one cold November day. I remember coming home from school and seeing Greg sitting in his car, staring blankly ahead. Usually he would greet me right away, flash me that goofy smile, and ask me how school was. This time he didn't. He just sat in the driver's seat, unmoving, like some crash test dummy, looking at the car parked in front of him on the street. I tried waving hello, but it was like he was in some sort of trance. I thought maybe he wasn't feeling well or something, so I decided to just leave him alone. The next day, I heard my mom speaking to someone outside the door while playing video games in the living room. I lowered the volume on the television and crawled over to the door and listened carefully. I immediately recognized Greg's voice, and he sounded distraught. I heard my mom keep telling him, "It's gonna be okay," and heard his inaudible sobbing replies. He spoke clearly enough at one point that I learned what was wrong with him. "She left me, Carol. I just can't believe it." I figured he was talking about his girlfriend Kelly, and I shook my head. I felt bad for him. He was a nice guy, and it seemed like he was happy with her. But when I heard him say goodbye to my mother, I scurried across the carpet like a panicked mouse and grabbed my PlayStation controller, laying on my belly. My mom came inside, closed the door, and sighed. I looked over at her. "What's wrong, Mom?" She gave me a sad smile. "Oh, nothing, sweetie." She then walked into the kitchen and began to prepare dinner. As I sat there playing Crash Team Racing, I couldn't get the sound of Greg sobbing out of my head. It was so painful, so sad. For a kid to hear someone in so much grief was an anomaly, on an emotional level anyway. We don't really understand the gravity of some situations until we're much older. As I was just a kid about to jump into middle school, how in the world could I understand the pain of a breakup? All I knew was that I felt really, really bad for the Pokemon Man. I didn't see Greg for the next few days, and I started to wonder if he was alright. It wasn't like him to be cooped up in his apartment. He was always roaming the complex in some kind of way. It was just really weird. Finally, one Saturday afternoon, I heard a door slam beneath our level, and I jumped up, ran to the front door, and looked over the railing. I spotted Greg, carrying a large garbage bag over his shoulder. "Hey, Greg! Pokémon Man!" I yelled. He didn't so much as turn around. I heard him quickly walk down the stairs and heard his car roar to life in the garage. I peered over the railing and saw him peel out into the street. I sighed and went back inside. At the time, I felt upset with him. It was hard being ignored as a kid. I mean, you guys know how it is. It was even harder being ignored by someone you admired. I didn't see Greg for about a week before I ran into him as I was coming up the stairs one evening with my mom, having just come back from the movies. When I saw him, I gasped. His dark hair was messy, like he'd just gotten out of bed. He looked extremely tired and sickly, like he'd been battling the flu. My mom gasped when she saw him, although I don't think she meant to do that. He looked at her and gave a small smile. "Oh, don't worry, Carol. I'm fine. A little bit under the weather, I'm afraid. I'll be better soon, though. Have a good doctor." My mom returned the smile and nodded. Okay, Greg. Well, I hope you feel better. Take care of yourself." He gave us a slight nod and continued down the stairs. As my mom and I continued our ascent, I turned around to look at Greg. I was startled to find him at the bottom of the stairs, peering at me from around the corner. He was staring at me and grinning. Just grinning. I wanted to grab my mom's blouse and say something, but I couldn't. I just stood there, at the top of the flight of stairs, looking at my neighbor giving me that creepy grin. After what seemed like maybe a minute, I saw him retreat behind the wall, and he was gone. I quickly followed my mom inside, my heart beating like a drum. That night as I slept, I couldn't get Greg's disturbing, smiling face out of my head. The next morning, I awoke to my mom speaking furiously to the landlord. I slowly climbed out of bed and went to the living room. I was shocked to see that our window was broken, a large crack along the side. To my surprise, my mom was holding a Pokeball in her hand. I looked past her to see the landlord holding his hands up and nodding. "Carol, trust me, I know. I'm really sorry. I'm gonna go talk to him. I'll fix this," the landlord said. My mom, clearly upset, nodded and handed the landlord the toy ball. She slammed the door and went into the kitchen. I followed her and sat at the dinner table. "Mom, what happened to our window? And why did you have a Pokeball in your hand?" Surprised to hear my voice, she jumped. All in her excitement, she didn't notice me behind her. She spun around and sighed. "Well, it looks like Greg was playing some kind of joke on us and caused some damage to our living room's window." "Greg? Why?" She shook her head, still irritated by the situation. "I really don't know. He threw that toy against the window with enough force that he cracked it, and started knocking on our door afterwards like a madman. I was about to call the police, but thankfully for Greg, the landlord had just pulled up to do some maintenance work on the garage port." I opened my mouth in shock. "Why would he act like that, Mom?" She sat down at the table. "I don't know, sweetie. No idea." Later that day, I heard my mom speaking to the landlord on the phone. Apparently, Greg was really sorry for what he did, and he didn't need to cause trouble. He offered to replace the window himself and apologized to us personally. When I heard this, I felt a little better about the way Greg was behaving lately. I thought maybe he was feeling better, beating the flu and just getting back to normal. The next day, however, we found out how terribly wrong I was. At about 3 p.m., my mom heard several forceful kicks at her door. She opened the door to find 2 policemen standing there, looking inside suspiciously. "How can I help you, officers?" The cops looked at her and showed her a picture of a man. She gasped when she saw whoever's face it was, and spoke in a hushed tone to the policeman. One cop called something on his radio and nodded to the other one, thanked my mom, and I heard them quickly descend the stairs. I went to the front door to stand by my mom, and just as I was about to ask her just what the heck was going on, I heard the cops beating on the door beneath us. The first person that popped into my mind was Greg. After a few minutes, I heard the door open and the cops say something. I heard what sounded like a struggle and suddenly a gunshot, and then another. My mom slammed the door shut. She told me to get in my room right away. I sat in my room in total silence, fear gripping my body. I soon heard sirens wailing, and then the distant sound of a car peeling out of the garage port. My mom never told me the facts of what really happened that day, but I'm thankful she didn't. I was way too young for the terrifying truth I would discover years later. From my research and of course the news reports I watched dozens of times over, I found out the truth about the Pokémon Man. Greg Hooper didn't exist, in the sense that it was an alias the man we knew as Greg used. It turned out that his real name was Kevin Larson, an escaped patient from a mental institution in Maine. He'd been on the run for 5 years, like a reclusive drifter before trying to settle down with a fake persona here in the city. He wasn't in marketing at all. He worked at a Red Robin and did various odd jobs to afford his rent and support his Pokemon-related addiction. Surprisingly enough, he actually did have a girlfriend named Kelly. She passed him illegal, non-prescribed street drugs to keep his, well, mind at check. As it were, Greg, or Kevin, suffered from a severe case of multiple personality disorder and psychopathic tendencies. His MPD created a new character for him to live through, not the Greg persona, but one based on his favorite thing in the world, Pokemon. Greg was institutionalized in Maine because he developed the idea that he was a Pokemon trainer being hunted down by none other than Jesse and James from Team Rocket. His institutionalization was a result of Greg murdering a couple by burning them alive, believing in his mind that he had sent out a Charizard and used flamethrower on them. As you can see, his psychosis was no joke. Anyway, starting a new life as Greg, he managed to find himself a girlfriend that passed him these antipsychotic meds that he had trouble getting outside the hospital, and he lived a normal, happy life. When she left him, however, that's when things went bad. When I saw him in the car that one day, that was the first day without his meds. When I saw him give me that creepy smile, I could only imagine he thought himself to be playing some sort of mischievous game with me, a fellow trainer in his mind. I'm assuming when he threw the Pokeball at our window, he was trying to catch something. Lastly, the most disturbing part of this whole thing was his encounter with the police. According to eyewitness accounts and the police report, when the two officers confronted Greg at his door, he had a gun on him. He was too quick for the cops' attempt to disarm him, and he shot them both. Thankfully, they survived, but their incapacitation allowed him to escape. Later, when the police searched his home, they found all sorts of disturbing things. Photographs of Pokemon plastered everywhere, some of them edited with faces of people. He had drugs and weapons of all kinds in a chest near his bed, labeled Ash's stuff. He had fake contact information written on a slip by his home phone, with people named Brock and Misty at the top. And the most disturbing of all was what the police found when they searched his bedroom closet. Inside the closet was Kelly. Her face painted yellow with bright red circles on her cheeks, and her mouth stapled horribly into a macabre grin. Her ears were purposefully disfigured to resemble pointy rodent ears, and a large yellow utility cable went through one side of her back and out the other, almost looking like a poorly made tail of some kind. Greg had made his own Pikachu. As for the Pokemon Man himself, well, he escaped from the authorities. He issued a statewide and eventual nationwide manhunt for him, but he was never found. To this day, I think about him. I wonder where he took off to. Over the years, I accepted his mysterious whereabouts and compare it to the thing he loved the most. Like a haunter, he disappeared into the air and was never seen again.